Hi, everyone. Welcome to Varsity Tutors SAT versus ACT 101. Which test is right for my child? So you probably have a child, or maybe you yourself are thinking about taking one of these tests, and you want to figure out which one you want to take. So we're going to talk about that today, and I hope we have fun. I hope it's really informative. I hope we break down some myths that you may have heard, and we'll see how it goes. We're going to do a pretty deep dive. So let me tell you about myself. My name is Eric Forster. I'm the Director of Learning Tools at Varsity Tutors, which is basically an editor-in-chief of our ACT and SAT content. We've done 6 books, tens of thousands of web content. I have more than a dozen years of experience teaching SAT and ACT. Some of my students have gone to Yale, Northwestern, Vassar, MIT, Johns Hopkins. I think Stanford didn't make this list somehow because it's a great school. I was educated at Harvard and a lot of other places, but most of you are probably interested in Harvard. I did well on the ACT to get in there. And yeah, I'm excited to talk to you today about this. So first off, I want to start with a poll. I want to know which test you might be thinking about taking right now. There's no right or wrong answer on this one, but let's see what you get. I've got SAT or ACT, SAT, and both the ACT and SAT, which is a good one if you don't know which one you're going to take. I thought neither wasn't probably the best one there. So go ahead and click on that. I'll give you a few seconds to see how we do. I see there are still some answers coming in. We're just about there. All right, I think we'll call it. So let's see what we got. A little more than half of you want to take both. You're thinking about taking both tests. That's pretty normal amount of people. It's usually about half, sometimes as low as a third. Nationally, we'll take both tests, but usually it's right around a half. And then SAT is narrowly beating out ACT right now. And that may change by the end, or it may not. You might feel more confident in the test you chose, or you might decide you don't need to take both, you only need to take one. So, all right, nice work. So let's talk about why we're doing this webinar. The ACT and SAT do differ in significant ways. They are more similar than they are different, but they do have some things that are quite different about them, and that might help you make a decision as to which one you want to take or which one where your time might be best used. Your child or you, if you're the one taking the test, might actually have a competitive advantage if you're taking one test over the other. You might see actually a bit of a difference in scoring because you're better attuned to one of the tests, and that's what we'll be looking at. So we'll cover the real differences between the tests so you can make an informed decision about whether or not you do have a competitive advantage taking one test over the other. There are a lot of myths out there about the tests. And we'll talk a little bit about those too, so we can kind of get those out of the way. These are some big picture differences. ACT has an English section, a math section, reading, and science. It's given in that order. There's an optional essay. Scoring is 1 to 36 on each section, and then that's put together in a composite score of 1 to 36 as well. It's a pretty extreme bell curve. So if you're at the top end of that bell curve, once you're hitting about 30, you're pretty much in the 98th percentile. And one of the things I've seen with students in the past is sometimes I have a student who's looking to get a 34. They're looking to get into some place like Washington University in St. Louis, or the University of Chicago, or Harvard, or Princeton. And they'll often be scoring around 31 or 32, and we just practice eliminating those mistakes so that they can hit that higher number. Oftentimes the difference between a 35 or 36 and a 31 and 32 is maybe 4 questions on the entire test of 215 questions, a very, very steep bell curve. So if you are, or your child is hitting those high numbers already and you're looking for a higher number, it is really about eliminating those errors and a lot of practice and getting the right test. So the SAT test has mostly equivalent sections. The writing and language test is equivalent to English. Math is equivalent to math. Reading and reading, there's no science section on the SAT. The essay is a little bit longer. The scoring is 400 to 1600. And again, it's a very severe bell curve. Once you're getting over about 1400, you're really, really high up there. Again, it's about eliminating those errors as you go along. It's given in a slightly different order than what I have here. I've matched them up across. When you actually take the test, you do the reading test first, then the writing and language test. The math test is split into two parts, a calculator, or excuse me, a no calculator test first, and then a calculator test. The essay, the optional essay, is at the end. So anyway, that's what you see here. I've given the timing. One of the things you'll see is that the ACT generally has less time per section. Does that necessarily mean that it's got more time pressure? I know it's out there that it's got more time pressure, and in some sections it does, but not necessarily. So we'll talk about that a bit too. Okay. A few more big picture differences. If you are a parent and you took either of these tests way back when, in the 90s or 80s or even the 70s, you'll know the ACT test. If you took it, it is virtually the same as ever. It really hasn't changed too much. It is more accessible to take if you live in the interior of the US, as in not on the east or west coast. What I mean by that is the test will be given more often. The guidance counselor at school might have more information about the test. It tends to be taken more in the Midwest and the Mountain West and the South. Colleges, however, have no preference toward the ACT or SAT. Very, very few of them anymore have any preference, and it's almost gone. It used to be the case that they might, but not anymore. The SAT test is not the test you parents took way back when. It was redesigned in 2015 to be more like the ACT, in fact. So they felt like the ACT had a pretty good model. And so these tests are actually quite similar. They do, again, have some important differences, though. The SAT does now incorporate Common Core into its testing, into its curriculum, essentially. So if, for example, if your child goes to a school that emphasizes a Common Core curriculum, the SAT might be something you're looking at that will be very familiar to that student. It is more accessible to take if you're on the East or West Coast. Again, you can take the ACT if you live in those places. It's not determining, but it is a little bit easier to get a test date typically. And again, colleges have no preference. So I think we'll do actually another poll right quick. And let me throw this one at you. This is just a little question about the SAT and the no calculator and calculator section questions on the math. Is it easier to take the no calculator question, or is it harder to take the no calculator question? Let's see what you think about that. We'll just hang on for a few more seconds here as we get that going. But the voting is very interesting. I can see it live as it comes up, which is kind of fun for me. And I'll reveal it to you guys in just a sec. All right, let's call it. I think we've got most of the votes in. Any last guesses? All right, so let's take a look at the results here. This one was incredibly even. An almost exact same number of you think that the no calculator questions are harder, as think they're easier, or that it makes no difference. In my opinion, I'm going to go with the it makes no difference crowd here. There are a couple of reasons for that. The no calculator questions are, in fact, designed for you not to have to use a calculator. And So that's kind of nice. You don't have to use a calculator on the calculator questions either. Some of them you probably need to, but you often need to make this choice. Do I want to use the calculator on this particular question? Is the calculator easier or better? Not necessarily. It can slow you down, and it can cause you to make errors that you wouldn't otherwise make. And I can give you a test to prove this. Write down a bunch of single number addition, 9 plus 1, 8 plus 3, 6 plus 5. You can all do this in your head super, super quick. As soon as I'm saying it, you know what the answer is. And then try to actually do that on a calculator. You'll make more mistakes if you're honest about it. You don't correct yourself. And it'll take you a lot longer. That's an extreme example, but that happens on these tests as well. Part of what they're testing is your time management and how much you're using that calculator as a crutch. So when you can get away with not using the calculator, that can actually help you. In terms of the sections, obviously no calculator is designed for no calculator, so you don't actually have that option, but just because you have the option to use the calculator does not mean you should. Just a little tidbit for you there. We think, technology is going to solve whatever, problem we're having and that it's always better, but it's not always when you're in a timed environment and when errors can actually add up. If you really want to do that in an extreme way, do it on your cell phone. Use the calculator on your cell phone where there's no tactile feedback whatsoever, and you will make many, many more errors. In fact, I guarantee you that. You can really test that yourself. It's kind of a fun test. Okay, so let's talk about some test myths. We'll start with the SAT no calculator section is easier or harder. It's not, as I just explained. The ACT test is more of a science test. It has a science section, right? So it must be, if you're going into STEM fields or you're going into science of any sort, science, technology, engineering, and math is STEM fields, that, ACT must be for you, right? Well, we're going to find out that SAT actually has a lot of science content in it, even though it doesn't have a dedicated science section. It's one of those things that it appears a certain way, but it's not in fact that way. The SAT is more of a math test because it's kind of got a reputation of being a little bit harder for a couple of different reasons. It tests quantitative reasoning a little bit more than straight concepts, but it's not necessarily more of a math test. Some test dates are easier than others. Oh, this is a good one. Everyone thinks this, and it's not actually true. What'll happen is you'll hear that the April test date is the easiest one. In both of this, or a May test date is definitely the easiest one. Wow, that was the easiest test, everyone will say. And it's because the students who are taking that test have been taking it since October. And it's their third test or their fourth test. So of course the practice has made it easier. Now, the truth is that some tests are, in fact, descriptively easier than others. That's not necessarily to your advantage. The test is both tests are graded on that severe bell curve. You're only graded against how everyone did. So if you have a really extremely hard test, less people will do well and they'll be stuck in the middle of that bell curve, and the extremes will be a little bit more spread out. So that means if you're a high scorer, a harder test can actually give you a bit higher score. You've got a little bit more leeway up at the top and things will spread out a little bit more. If you have a technically easier test that everyone did better on, all of the students are still going to be moved right to the middle of that test, to that scoring range. And then really right at the top, things become very compressed, and missing one question can take you from like a 35 on the ACT down to a 33 or 32. It's extraordinary when you get those slightly easier tests. So the most important thing about that is don't worry about it. Don't worry about if you're sitting for an easy test or a hard test. You are only graded against how everyone else is doing, or your child is, as the case may be. And so everybody else is having a harder time or everybody else is having an easier time. The SAT, another myth, has arcane vocabulary and trick questions. That used to be true back when you parents were taking the test. It did have a lot of just completely out of context vocabulary. You might get defenestrate on that, which means to throw someone out of a window, from Latin, defenestra. Anyway, and it had some a little bit misleading questions. where, it's a little bit hard to kind of figure out what they're even asking you. And the SAT abandoned that strategy in 2015 when they decided to become more like the ACT. And so you might even have also, if you're a student, you might have an older brother or sister who took the older version of the ACT, or the SAT, excuse me. And they've given you these kind of myths, which were true for them at their time, but are no longer true. Similarly, the ACT has more math word problems than SAT. It's no longer true. Used to be true, no longer true as a test, particularly the SAT, has changed. So anyway, let's move along here now that we've gotten past some of the myths. Let's talk about test timing. Does it matter? It does matter. It matters a lot. But this chart doesn't tell you how it matters. And this is a chart I've made up by just doing a little bit of math, but you can find it all over the internet. You can find it kind of everywhere. And I would say it's not a particularly useful breakdown of where you're going to see the time pressure. So the English section on the ACT test is 36 seconds per question, whereas the SAT test, the writing and language section, you have 48 seconds per question. So it must be easier. It must be easier to get through, right? And by the way, the English section on ACT is 36 seconds per question. It's the least of any section on either test. Must have the highest time pressure. Completely false. It has the least time pressure of any test. It's incredibly easy to get through the English section on the ACT, despite only 36 seconds per question. Why? Many of the questions are asking you about grammar and punctuation, and you either know it and see it and do it straight away, or you don't know it and you see it, or you see what you think it should be and you do it straight away. And it takes 3 seconds to put the comma in the right place, or as it happens, to put the comma in the wrong place. It doesn't take a lot of deep thought to do that sort of thing. And that's what those tests, the English and the writing and language tests, are primarily about. They've got some other things in there, but if we go down to the science section of the ACT, 52 seconds per question, the same as the reading section on the ACT. It is absolutely the hardest time management section on either of these two tests. The reading section can be tough, but many of your children, or many of you, if you're tuning in and are going to take the test, are pretty quick readers, and if you have the right kinds of strategies, can get through that reading section at 52 seconds a question pretty well. The science section, it is always a challenge, even for high scorers, because you're trying to take a lot of different things from a lot of different places and put them all together in a way that makes sense. It is very easy to confuse table 1 with figure 1 in the science section under that kind of time pressure. I can score a 36 on that science section every single time I take it, and I still feel time pressure. So you should know about that. Overall, you do have more time generally per question on the SAT, but overall it's also about the same in terms of time pressure, except for that science section on the ACT. You will hear another myth that we didn't cover, that the ACT has more time pressure, but that's primarily based on the impression of the science section, which is where you end unless you do the essay. So that last impression often leaves that kind of feeling in test takers' minds. All right. So we're going to do a deep dive. We're going to look at this section by section. And the reason we're going to do that is on each section, you or your student or child may have a very strong proclivity one way or the other. And that might be different test to test. You might come out even and say, yeah, I'm going to take them both. Or you might decide that all goes one way and you think SAT is for me. So we'll look at that, what the real differences are in each test. We'll compare these across the board to each other. I've listed them up there. We'll even compare the ACT science section to something on the SAT. All right, let's take a look here. ACT science versus SAT whatever. As I said, ACT science is really tough in terms of time pressure. It's absolutely the toughest. I can guarantee you that. 6 or 7 sections it'll be arranged in, those 40 questions. It is not about science knowledge at all. If you are brilliant in honors chemistry, or your child or student is brilliant in honors chemistry, it doesn't necessarily really help you in, or help that person in ACT science. Everything's in front of you. It's primarily analyzing data and reading as quickly as possible. And all the information you need will be right there on the page in front of you. SAT Science, where is it? Pro tip, it is everywhere on that test, just about. It's in the reading section, the writing language section, and in the statistics and modeling questions of the math section. But the two tests test the same skills, just in a different format. It's very focused on the ACT. You know what you're getting and how much time you have. And it's all over the place on the SAT, but it's still very much test science. So the SAT can feel a little bit more arcane as you get sort of science subscores and things like that. And the ACT can feel a little bit more straightforward. Is one better for you or worse for you? Well, the ACT is your choice if you want to train for a predefined set of questions, 40 questions, 35 minutes. And if you're strong, or your student or child strong under time pressure, and you may not be strong today under time pressure, but you can learn to be strong under time pressure. There's real techniques to that. It's a very material kind of thing, real strategies for that. Most people can figure out how to do that. So that can be a real competitive advantage for somebody who doesn't, against somebody who doesn't know how to do that and is only getting through 25 of those questions. SAT is your choice if you want an integrated approach to science. It's also your choice if you do really struggle with the time pressure on the ACT Science, but you literally get all of it right. If you get 35 questions right every time, but can't get through those last 5 every single time, even after trying very, very hard to train for that, SAT Science should be your preference. So you should lean that way and sort of put a tick in that column for SAT if that's the case. But I don't want to scare anyone off of the ACT here just because, you say time pressure and everyone gets a little bit nervous. It really can be an advantage for you if you train to do that. All right, so let's do another quick poll. Let's do a poll about the ACT Science section here. And so the question is the ACT Science section presented in a predictable order? Are the questions predictable? Yes, it goes like physics and then chemistry and then biology, or no, it's random. You get a random order. Votes are coming in quickly on this one. Go for a few more seconds, see if anybody wants to give it a go, give it a guess. All right. Let's take a look at the results. Most of you got this right. 78% of you said no, it is random. It is random on the ACT Science section. You never quite know what order you're going to get things in. You can skip ahead. If you train to go in a certain kind of, if you understand, hey, I really like doing a data analysis question first, you can always skip ahead to that data analysis question. But it is a random order. You don't even know if you're going to get 6 or 7 actual sections, essentially, to that test. All right. So let's take a look at just what some of this looks like. This is an ACT science section. It's a paired passage section. So on practice passage A, we have one scientist saying, talking about the colors of animals. In practice passage B, we have a different scientist saying something else about the color of animals. And then you'll get several questions to figure out which one's right. And sometimes the question changes who's right there. Given this evidence, is scientist A or scientist B correct? You will see this also on the SAT, but it will be in the reading section. You'll get side-by-side stuff, and sometimes it'll be science. So that's where you'll see that. But on the ACT, you will only see this over here. You'll see this kind of stuff as well. This isn't the whole question, but you'll see a lot of graphs and tables. Again, ACT Science, you'll see this stuff mostly just in the science section. And on the SAT, you will see it in the math section under statistics, modeling, that sort of thing. All right, let's take a look at ACT versus reading versus SAT reading. There are some significant differences here. It looks like you have a lot more time pressure in the ACT reading, but that's not necessarily true. The timing is the same as the science, but you're just reading. You're not trying to correlate reading and tables and everything that comes at you during the ACT science section. So it has 4 sections to it: prose fiction, natural science, social sciences, and humanities. Humanities is going to be nonfiction, creative nonfiction, essays, sometimes a little philosophy, something like that is going to come up in the humanities section. SAT reading, you have a little bit more time, but you do have 5 passages: history, social studies, science, and 2 of the 5 passages will have a chart, graph, or table. So that's getting a lot of, again, that science side into it. So even though it looks like the timing's easier here, the timing is just about as difficult as the ACT reading, because correlating all of that information is a little bit more difficult, as you see on the ACT science section. So the one thing that's not pictured here is SAT reading will always have some kind of prose fiction in it in one of the 5 passages. But I will tell you that the biggest difference between these 2 tests is the prose fiction section on the ACT reading. It's a quarter of your score. And remember, if you're scoring very high, those kinds of numbers can make a difference. It doesn't sound like a quarter is much more than a fifth, but it actually is. And if you have 10 questions on prose fiction and SAT reading out of 52, that is fewer questions percentage-wise than 10 out of 40 that you're going to get over on the ACT reading. Now, why am I pointing out prose fiction? Everything else here, except for some of the humanities, some of those essays, is very linear. Natural science is going to chain together one idea, cause, effect, cause, effect. Social science is going to do that. History is going to do that. To a large extent, even the essays in the humanities section are going to do that. The science sections are all going to do that. Cause, effect, going to build a very logical argument. In prose fiction, you have no idea where you are. It is the most disorienting thing that you can imagine. All the rest of these, you can really build up a kind of sense of context. In a science passage, you might see a word you don't know. You might be reading about some scientific discovery that you don't fully understand, but you've got enough context to build around that to put together at least some pretty educated guesses and some good inferences about what's going on. Prose fiction, rather less so. You're right in the middle of who knows what. You don't even know if it's the beginning of the story. You don't know if it's the end. You don't know who the characters are. It is a very, very different kind of reading and is a much larger percentage, when it gets down to it, of the ACT reading section than the SAT reading section. There's some of it on the SAT, but it also leads the ACT reading section, which can terrify everyone, unless your student, your child, or you are really strong in literature, taken a lot of English classes. You might even know the passage that comes up, or at least know the author who's written it and have an idea of what's going on. And that can be a competitive advantage there. So the ACT is your choice if you're stronger with fiction, and both linear and non-linear approaches to reading. That prose fiction section really requires you to jump around a lot. That first paragraph doesn't make sense until you come back and read, until you've read the rest of it. SAT is your choice if you're stronger in history and science. It definitely has a history section in it, and it also not only has a science section, which is basically an article, but then it requires scientific reasoning as well, with charts and graphs, and putting that sort of thing together. So we have another poll here, so we'll get that out for you. And we're going to launch this one. And the question is the reading section of either test in a predictable order? So order of topics. I may have given this one away a little bit, but we'll see how it goes. The voting is interesting, as usual. Love it. I'm really pleased to see so many of you showing up for this webinar too. I really do hope it's helpful. All right, we're coming to the close. Any last guesses? All right. See how we did. Pretty interesting. Most of you said the order of topics is random on each test. A fair amount of you, the next most, both have the same order. The The one that's right here is the ACT has the same order of topics on each test. It will go in the same order every single time. And that can be an advantage if you like seeing that sort of thing. The SAT will throw whatever at you whenever. And you don't know if you're starting with history, if you're starting with science over there. You're not quite sure. So that can be a minor thing, but an interesting thing. Sometimes being focused on it's going to be this, I expect this next, and this can be really useful. If you like that sort of thing, the ACT might be a little bit more for you. Otherwise, if you're not worried about that, it's probably, it's probably a push on that one. All right. Let's take a look. This is one of my favorite things right here. Some of you might not be able to read this, so I will read it aloud, also for effect. So this is a prose fiction passage adapted from the Cask of Amontillado by Edgar Allan Poe from 1846. And let's have a little bit of a read here and see how terrifying this can be, or how advantageous it can be if you know a little bit of Poe, or you know how to approach this kind of thing, which again, you can approach through training. The 1,000 injuries, I'm not gonna read the whole thing, of Fortunato, I had borne as best I could. But when he ventured upon insult, I vowed revenge. This guy isn't a very nice guy, or woman, I don't know who's speaking. You, who so well know the nature of my soul, do I just started reading this, it's timed, I have 35 minutes to get done with this, will not suppose, however, that I gave utterance to a threat. Would I not suppose that? I suppose I wouldn't, but that's what he's telling me. Even though I know so well the nature of his soul, I don't know who's speaking here. I don't know if this is the beginning of the story. I don't know who Fortunato is. This is what's going on. At the end of this paragraph, I just want to give you this tidbit here. A wrong is unredressed when retribution overtakes its redresser. I don't know, is that true? It is equally unredressed when the avenger fails to make himself felt as such to him who has done the wrong. So you have a few minutes to sort of figure out what's going on there. But you can see that sometimes, and this is a pretty typical passage that can show up really on either ACT or SAT, but it's weightier over on the ACT. And you might get a lot of hints about what's going on here, or what the author is even trying to say, or who he's talking about, or who he is, or she is, by getting further down the passage. And that is a little bit unusual compared to all of the other kinds of reading that you will see on either of these two tests. Here's just a quick example of an SAT reading section where the science is incorporated. It's an article about the nitrogen cycle, and I haven't given you the full graph over here because it wouldn't fit. But after reading this article, there is a graph, and it's a fairly complex one, in which the student is then taking information from the article he or she just read, and then answering questions about that graph table, perhaps taking that graph or table and cross-referencing it with another graph or table. This is why you have a little bit more time on the SAT reading section, because the science is incorporated. This kind of thing you only see on the ACT science section. Okay. Let's take a look at ACT math versus SAT math. I'm sure many of you are very interested in this. Again, if you look at the timing, it appears that ACT math is tougher, but I would say it's not. 60 questions in 60 minutes. Overall, it's 58 questions in 80 minutes on SAT math, but it's a different ball of wax over there. So on the ACT math, calculator is allowed throughout. Should you use it? It depends, as we talked about earlier. It can slow you down. It can make you more error prone. And sometimes it's just not that useful for a particular kind of question. There are more geometry questions on the ACT math section. So if you're strong in geometry, that's something that might lead you to think, hey, I might want to put a tick in the box over on the ACT side here. It is primarily kind of what we would call school math that relies on concepts. It's the kind of thing you're going to see in your math class. It's going to be the hypotenuse of a triangle, or the diagonal of a square, which is the same thing usually, or a pretty straightforward algebraic question. There are 5 answer choices per question. There are only 4 on SAT math. And by the way, there's no guessing penalty on either of these tests. There used to be a guessing penalty on SAT. That's another one of those things that changed. There is no longer a guessing penalty. So that, you always want to answer every single question. You just go, if you run out of time, just go straight down. Just pick A or pick D, whatever. Just go straight down the list, all the way down. SAT math, 38 questions in 55 minutes with the calculator, 20 questions in 25 minutes with no calculator. There are 13 grid-in questions, and we'll take a look at one of those shortly if that doesn't make sense to you. It's a non-multiple choice question. You really just have to get the answer. You can't kind of guess on it too well. And they're spread out through the 2 sections. It relies on reasoning more than concepts. So it's very much a kind of quantitative reasoning test, a QR. That's a big distinction, right? ACT, very much concept-oriented, something you might see in school. SAT, it's quantitative reasoning, and I'll show you some differences between those 2 kinds of questions. Also, you're more likely to have multiple skills tested on each question in SAT math, which is why you have more time. You might find that you don't actually have more time. There are definitely more statistics and data questions over on SAT math because of the science component as much as anything. But your guessing is a little bit higher percentage, so you only have 4 answer choices. So if you like geometry and conceptual approaches and school math, ACT math is your choice. If you like stats and quantitative reasoning, and some of your students' children, and some of you may have experience with quantitative reasoning, SAT math is where you're going to excel in all likelihood. So let's do one more poll. I promise this is actually the last one, but it's an interesting one. I think you'll be interested to know this. And it's, what level of math should the test taker have completed to be fully prepared for the ACT or SAT, to be confident in answering every single question? What level of math do you need? All right, looks like we're getting there. I'm going to close the poll. Any last guesses? All right, let's take a look at the results. So the 7% of you who voted calculus will be relieved to know that neither of these tests calculus. So that's exciting for you in all likelihood. Algebra and geometry, yes, those are both useful on both of these tests. But, and then pre-calculus and trigonometry are actually pretty much the same thing. So either of those is basically right. 59% of you got that. Pre-calculus is using a lot of trigonometry and algebra. But I would say, generally the trig is pretty basic, and it's never more than 4 or 5 questions. So that would be to be fully prepared for the math section, trigonometry. But if you're good on algebra and geometry and even basic math, you can get everywhere on either of these tests but the toughest 4 or 5 questions. So don't fear if your student hasn't done pre-calc or trigonometry. It can still, the math section is not still going to be tremendously difficult from that standpoint, and there is no calculus. So a relief for some of you, I'm sure. Calculus it takes too long, I think, for testing in this kind of format, so they just never get up there. All right, let's take a look at a couple of SAT math questions. So there's a grid-in question right there that I was talking about. That the cursor is on. So you get the question there about the angle of that triangle, and now you have to figure out what that is, and you could have any number on that, any decimal point, anything. And then over in the middle and on the right, those go together, and that is, you've got a table, and it's also very much quantitative reasoning question, because if you look at the question, each car's motion can be described by an equation. Which equation describes that? Is it quadratic or linear? That's not exactly concept math, right? You're not solving something. Let's take a look at ACT math and you'll see the difference. Here's ACT math: hypotenuse of a triangle, algebraic fractions. Percentages, compound percentage on a salary raise, those are pretty straightforward. Those are not quantitative reasoning sorts of questions. It's the sort of thing that many times you're going to see at your school, unless your school is doing something like Common Core, where a lot more of the QR, the quantitative reasoning, is brought in. All right. Now we're going to talk really quickly about ACT English versus the SAT Writing and Language sections. 75 questions, 45 minutes. Very few people will ever have a time pressure issue on that or on the SAT Writing and Language section. Again, a lot of it is periods, commas, semicolons. So usage and mechanics, which is your grammar and punctuation. Sentence structure, which is syntax, right? Is the clause in the right places there? Should that be a dependent clause or independent clause, that sort of thing. Rhetorical skills, which are logic, as well as your ability to convince, all come under what are called rhetorical skills. It's not just rhetoric. Same thing on SAT Writing and Language. They just break it down a little differently. Standard English conventions is usage and mechanics and sentence structure together. Expression of ideas is rhetorical skills. It has some science content. I would say that doesn't particularly matter here. It doesn't really, it's topically science, but it's still asking you grammar and expression kinds of questions. So here's an example of this first one. This first box is ACT English. And you can see over there, it's an apostrophe question. Where should we have the apostrophe, or should we have one for Napoleon? And the bottom two boxes here are, those are the SAT Writing and Language. And again, it's an apostrophe question. These are the kinds of questions you're going to see over and over and over on these two sections. And I would say there's very little difference. I would not distinguish either of these tests based on this. This is not what you're going to look at. The SAT Writing and Language does have science, so we're talking about the bandwidth of a pigeon carrying a flash drive, but that's not serious science, right? It's topical. Let's talk very quickly about the optional essays. Should you take them even? And what the differences are. I would say it can be useful to take the optional essay, but the college you're applying to is already probably getting a writing sample or two, and not very many colleges or universities require this. It's very, very rare, maybe 24. And so it is an optional essay. If one of the colleges you're applying to does require it, this could be pretty heavy. The other place I think this makes a big difference is if you are a very high scorer, if you're up over 85th or 90th percentile, looking at everything else, the admissions committee might say, well, this person scored really well on the essay section. The essay section does not affect any part of the rest of the test. It's scored independently. I think 1 to 6 is the scoring in both cases. It's 40 minutes for the ACT essay. You take a position. It's a position paper. Prompt asks you to take one of 3 positions and argue it. No position is right or wrong. One example might be freedom and security or something else, right? Do you sacrifice your freedom for security, or do you sacrifice security for freedom? Make an argument about that in 40 minutes. 50 minutes for the SAT essay. You have to read something and then write a critical analysis of that thing. Those of you out there who know a bit about writing know that that's considerably harder than making an argument. That's not necessarily a bad thing. If you have a good writer who is taking this test, that can really set that writer apart. Somebody who, again, has taken a lot of writing classes or English classes, something like this, or is able to, in a convincing manner, take an argument apart or somebody else's argument, or analyze something. Analyze means, in Greek, to break something apart, to loosen it, is what you're doing. So you're breaking something into its component parts. But particularly for, I would say, this age group of 17 and 18-year-olds, that is a bigger challenge. Again, that can still be a competitive advantage for the right 17 or 18-year-old. So you choose the ACT if you want to make powerful, direct, logical arguments about a topic while anticipating the objections to your position. You choose the SAT if you're a strong reader who can see the gaps in someone else's writing, and you're good at pulling those gaps open. But that is harder. I'd say that's more of a sophomore in college kind of thing. That's 20-year-olds who are usually starting to get a handle on that, 19, 20-year-olds. But that doesn't mean, plenty of folks out there, plenty of students who are 16, 17, 18 can be exceptional at that sort of thing. And if you are one of those people, or your child is, wow, it can be a huge advantage if you're choosing to do that, to do the SAT. Because again, they're graded against each other. They're looking at literally millions of these essays. All right, so ACT or SAT, which is it? That's the question we're trying to answer. It's rare that any student will have an exclusive proclivity one way or the other, but some of you might have discovered something about yourself. So go back and look at the sections, which way your child or you might lean. A tendency will often enough appear one way or the other. And just as we saw in our own polling, about a third to a half of students take both tests. Now, let's say you've been studying for the ACT and everything I've told you has made you really just want to take the SAT. Studying for one test will often improve the student in both. The tests are more similar than they are different. So you should be excited about that. If you've been studying for one and you really feel, hey, wow, I might be better, or my student or child might be better at this other one, that's actually great news, right? That could be a serious score increase just by hitting on those proclivities. So don't be sad if you've done some study or some tutoring in one and that you've chosen the wrong one. There is no wrong one here. So speaking of studying, this is where I'm going to tell you some of the hard stuff. ACT and SAT aren't IQ tests at all. They don't measure cognitive ability. They really don't. And so never take it that way. Just like everything else in life, and parents, you know this, improvement happens with practice. It's just like ice skating. It's just like practicing medicine or law. It's just like reading or writing or driving a car. It's like anything. Improvement happens with practice. I cannot stress that enough. The more practice a student has, the better they will tend to do, up to whatever their capacity is. So taking a lot of practice tests help. It helps a lot. Taking the ACT or SAT or both more than once helps. That's why that April or May test can be easy, right? Because everyone's taken a bunch of them. Focusing on areas where in which the student is weakest helps. How do you figure that out? Getting the right tutor and sticking with the tutoring helps a lot. And I can't actually express that enough. Tutors are really good at identifying where students have a hard time. They're good at connecting with students, explaining things in ways that students may not be used to, haven't seen in a book or whatever else, and engaging those weaknesses, turning them into strengths. It's just a huge thing. I've never seen anyone get worse with tutoring or even stay the same with tutoring. So, and when I say sticking with the tutoring, sometimes we get up to a certain level and we think we're there. But that tutor often brings a lot of confidence into the room with him or her. And so the student is out on test day, the tutor's not there, and the things suddenly evaporate. And so just getting a little extra practice makes all the difference. It's really adding in just a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more, until the student is really very comfortable there. Of course, at Varsity Tutors, we do specialize in tutoring. And so that's an option you have. And I think a very nice option. We do one-on-one tutoring wherever you like, at the library, in your home, and online. We do a lot of online tutoring. And we also do group classes. So some students do better in a group. So we do group classes as well. We've just started that recently. So that is the webinar. There's going to be a survey coming out. You'll get an email in about an hour. There is a survey on that email. It helps us a lot if you answer the questions. I know you get a lot of surveys. I know your time is very valuable. I appreciate all of you coming. And I'm going to open it up for questions here. You'll see a question sort of spot show up on your control panel widget so that you can ask questions. And I will answer some of them verbally if I can. And I have also an assistant here. The other thing is, if you have questions, you can also email me if you like. So I'm just Eric at varsitytutors.com, E-R-I-C, Eric at varsitytutors.com. You can send me your questions, and because something might occur to you tonight or tomorrow, or you might not get a word in edgewise over here in the questions section. But we have about, it looks like about 11 minutes. And so we'll start. What age should students start preparing for either the ACT or SAT? That's a great question. And so Duke University has a program where they actually hit middle schoolers. I think on one of the tests, and off the top of my head, I can't remember which one. So they consider that not to be too early. I would say I wouldn't go earlier than that ever. And I would set expectations for a 13-year-old. The scores are not going to be as high as they're going to be later. So that's very important to set that expectation. And also, if you're a parent, it is to use your judgment there. Is it going to be too challenging? You can try it, try some practice things, work with your teachers or the guidance counselor. I wouldn't go younger than 13. Most students aren't really starting until at least 16 years old. So set those expectations, though, for younger students so that they're not becoming frustrated because they won't have achieved usually all of that math. They may have, but it still might be a stretch. The timing will still be a stretch. So use your best judgment as a parent. Yes. I can get you a copy, email me, and I can get you a copy. It's actually Google Slides. It's not actually a PowerPoint, but I can get you a copy of that. Also, this whole thing is being recorded. So if you would like to watch me talk at you again, you can do that. And I have a hard time watching myself, but other people might not have as hard a time. So we will be making that available as well. We'll have a link to that, so you can watch this again and again. We're excited to. If you retake an SAT or ACT test, does the new score trump the last score? Is the highest score always valid? So that is actually a really good question. And the thing is, at the end of the test, the student has the option to submit those scores, and it's usually it's often before they know the score. But I'll actually do a little bit of research on this one to make sure, because I think it's a little bit different for each test, whether or not you take the highest score, whether or not you take the latest score. And I can get you that answer, Josh, to make sure that I have it exactly. I don't want to make a mistake there, and there are some subtleties that I don't quite have at the top of my mind. So definitely, Josh, if you just email me at eric@varsitytutors.com, email me that same question, I can get you the answer by tomorrow, and it'll be an informed answer rather than me guessing, because it changes all the time is the thing. There was a time when it was one of the things you're asking, as a time was the other thing you're asking, and I want to make sure we get that one right. From an admissions standpoint, is there any downside to taking one or both tests multiple times? No. So one thing I know that will happen, and this is an exception and not the rule, and it's based on schools. Sometimes schools will cherry pick your best science score and your best English score and your best writing score or whatever. Those are usually not the highest, the most difficult schools to get into, but they will actually allow you to sort of cherry pick. But no, there is absolutely no downside to taking multiple tests multiple times. It's expected, especially from even very high achievers. It is expected, and they don't look at that. They're not concerned about that at all. Never be afraid to take extra tests. Never be afraid to do more with ACT and SAT. So James Shin asks, he said, actually, let me see if that one's been answered. James, you mentioned, you heard me talking about bell curves, percentiles, and comparing scores to others. Do colleges focus more on percentiles or raw score? Both. It depends. And what I wish they would do consistently across the board is I wish that they would focus on percentiles. They're not going to focus on your raw score. Your raw score is literally how many you got right overall. That doesn't have any implication anywhere outside of the person who's scoring the test. So colleges aren't looking at that raw score at all. They're seeing the 1 to 36 or the 1400 to 1600 score, which is a kind of composite score that's built on that raw score, that's adjusted based on how everybody else's raw score went. So sometimes colleges say, you know, it's a particular number, like a 32 on the ACT or a 1400 on the SAT. The reality is oftentimes they're looking at percentiles because they know that the percentiles shift from test to test. So just by a little bit, so a 31 might be, you know, 98th percentile on one test, and that's a 32 the next time. But that's school to school. You have to ask the school. I wish they would focus exclusively on percentiles. I think it's more useful. But they often like to use that kind of, that composite score. They won't look at raw scores at all. And again, raw score is literally how many did you get right compared to how many you got wrong. That's interpreted via the 36 or the 1600. Let's see. I think I've hit all the questions. Oh, no, we've got more. Yes, Suzanne, the webinar will be available to watch again. I have to upload it and I have to do some conversion and all of that. It should be available to watch tomorrow. And so we'll get a link out there. And yeah, so we're running out of time. We've got about 4 more minutes. How many attempts is too many? Asked Caroline. That's a good question. At some point, oh, by the way, the link to the webinar recording that we're making right here, including probably this part, it'll be mailed out with the survey. So we'll get that out to you. And so how many attempts is too many? It costs money to take these tests, so that's part of it. Generally, I would say that you should see some improvement on the second test. If you're not seeing improvement on the second test, get some tutoring. And certainly by the third test, I would say 4 tests is you're starting to push out there on the boundary. The tests might have a limit as far as how many you can take in a year. Most standardized tests do have that limit. If you email me at eric@varsitytutors.com, I will actually answer that absolutely, because it might be different between the 2 tests. And again, it changes every year. So usually there is a limit. Okay, so what is the suggested timeline, asks Deborah. I would starting early is good, or late junior year. So spring of junior year, certainly no later than fall of senior year. Get moving on those real tests. No matter how many practice tests you take and how well you do on them, or your student does, you really want to see what's going on under the real conditions. And but spring of junior year is a really great time to start taking things. The skills are generally there already, and then you get a good baseline and plenty of time to keep going. But even fall of junior year is a good time. You definitely, no matter what, you want to be able to take, I would say, you want to have at least 3 test dates lined up before applications are due. You want to be able to take that test at 3 times. Maybe your student will do great on the first one, yay! But maybe not, and often as not. So, and yes, we can get you, Sonia. We can get you webinar slides for this, and of course the recording as well. So, let's see. Do we have more questions? I have like 2 more minutes, and if I don't get to your question here, or Drew doesn't in the typing, please just email it to me, Eric, E-R-I-C, @varsitytutors.com. And I will definitely answer your question. Okay, I think we covered that one. Yes, you could use your highest ACT score usually. There may be some restrictions on that, but I'll definitely send that out. How do I structure practicing the ACT and SAT when you have just a year to go? No, actually, just a year to go is just fine. That's plenty of time to improve remarkably in either test. So I would say that's a pretty standard course. You are not under massive time pressure with just a year to go. That's not going to be an issue. that's plenty of time. Usually 4 months, 6 months, anything more than 6 months is going to be, plenty of time to improve. Derek asks, how much practice do I recommend? As much as you can stand, as much as you have time for, and as much as you feel like you've improved to the point where you are not going to improve anymore. There's a diminishing returns kind of thing. And so sometimes you're up pretty high in one section and you need to spend more of your time somewhere else. All right, there are a ton more questions in here and we are at time. So I'm sorry if I did not get to your question, but if I did not get to your question and Drew didn't get to your question because we were inundated with them, unsurprisingly, please email it to me at eric@varsitytutors.com and I will absolutely answer it. I'll have it answered by tomorrow. And on a couple of them, if I said, I need to research it a little bit, I'll get you a solid answer. I'll check with the test people themselves because, again, they change that every year. And always on that check back every year because they change those kinds of rules all the time. Thank you very much, everyone, for showing up at this webinar. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. We're hoping to do more of these for other tests and for this one or for these two. And so I hope it was useful in helping you determine which one you're going to take. Thank you from me, Eric Forster at Varsity Tutors, and use our resources and as you see fit. And of course, we do offer a lot of good tutoring. So, and good luck. This is tough, good stuff, but good luck on doing as well as you possibly can. And remember that it's just a test. It really is just a test. It doesn't tell you who you are. It doesn't determine you in any way. And I mean that. I really do mean that. It's about what you do when you get out of school, not just what school you get into straight away. So, but aim high and good luck. All right. Thank you very much, everyone.